Our first speaker, shall we say formally, is Mr. Ian Macaulay, the Chief Executive. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I would just stress that this is not really a Southern Water event. I wanted to welcome everyone here. We've got an absolutely fabulous set of people around the table. I think we're in for a wonderful discussion. But it's a discussion about the future of water in the South East. So the document that you've all had is not a Southern Water document per se. It's been prepared independently. And it's quite challenging to be sandwiched between two of the biggest brains in the UK, I think, here. But Peter has written this document for us, really to challenge people's thinking on how might the world of water change over the next 20 to 30 years. What are the big trends that we need to think about? What are the differences that we should be considering? Looking back at the past, in my view, is no way to predict the future, and we need to do water completely differently as we go forward. So that's what this is about. We will carry anything that gets developed in here into our thinking for our business plan, which will be coming over the next year. But so that's all I wanted to say, other than welcome. I'm looking forward to some really, really good discussion and some really sort of invigorating thoughts about innovation. I will hand you over now directly to Professor Dieter Helm, who's going to challenge our thinking from the outset, I believe. Dieter.
Thanks, Ian. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to say just a few words as a kind of warm-up for Peter and the substance of discussion. And I should apologise in advance. I'll have to slip out just before 7 o'clock this evening in order to get back to some students early tomorrow morning. I don't want to preempt or scoop the main and serious and fundamental themes that are in Peter's paper, but I thought it would be quite helpful to set it in a context, a broader context, which provides the coat hangers, if you like, for the water industry, and also the peer review coming up. So, in its broadest context, you have to go back to 2011 and the white paper on the natural environment, which was the first white paper produced on the subject for well over a decade, which Caroline Spellman brought forward. And in that white paper, the government at the time committed itself to be the first government to leave the natural environment, obviously includes water, in a better state for future generations than it currently is. And that had all the features of a white paper, you know, great notion, long time in the future, politicians will all be dead long before, they're getting younger actually, some of them may still be around. As I once pointed out to David Cameron, he might actually live to see whether he delivered it. But there's bold ambitions there, and also in that paper was another substantive point, which was the idea that environmental policy from now on should be part of economic policy, and therefore essentially part of the Treasury's job. Now, as goes with many white papers, there were lots of pictures, there were these broad ideas, but no clear idea of how to do it. And so they thought, classic Whitehall style, we'll set up a committee to do it. And that's the origin of the Natural Capital Committee. So you think how to do it is the take from that. Well, 5 secretaries of state later, and perhaps 6 soon, we are gradually moving towards a comprehensive 25-year environment plan, which is due in January. And this is supposed to be the plan which delivers not just holding the line, but improving the natural environment. Now, the 25-year plan was the Natural Capital Committee's idea, as were the pioneers, which for the water industry, the Cumbrian catchment is the most pertinent. Now the government confronts the problem of filling it in a credible way. Now, as Peter's paper spells out, And indeed, as the statistics, as we've got the Office of National Statistics producing natural capital accounts now, show, holding the line is a hell of a task, let alone going forward. In fact, we are going backwards, and we have been going backwards since 2011 when the government announced that the intention was to go forward. And it's not hard to see why. It's such a difficult challenge to even keep the line in place. If you look around United Kingdom, the population increase is significant. It's not that long ago when we were supposed to have an ageing population and a serious concern about the balance of workers to retired people, etc. Since then, we've seen up to 500,000 added to the population per annum. A lot of the add to the population are young people who've completely changed demographic, young families, young children. It's quite dynamically different, especially in the southeast, but through the economy. But if you add 500,000 people per annum and you end up adding 10 million to the population and you want to put 2 more million people in London, there are bound to be problems on the environmental side unless you actively plan those into the fray. So the first big challenge is a lot more people. That leads to the second big challenge, a lot more houses. And a lot more houses, a lot more people mean a lot more demand for essential services, for infrastructure, for energy, for water, for sewerage services, for recreational purposes. The pressures become bigger. And remember, the southeast is one of the most densely populated places in the world. This is not a kind of, you have to go across into the Netherlands to find areas as densely populated, or to Hong Kong. So we're not talking about some sort of, nice rural idyll with lots of nice fields and a few towns that might take a bit of the green belt. When you start to talk about aggregates of the 300,000 houses per annum, you really are beginning to put big pressures on. Then you've got to add airports, new roads, cars, volumes are actually increasing again now. People's desire to travel, just put them on top one after another. And then the need for using lots of land for renewables, because renewables are very land intensive, farmland, etc. So lots of pressures, and food production and so on. So to try to put this together in a comprehensive way and move forward daunts a lot of people. But there I think one has to kind of stand back. The natural environment, our water environment, is not a nice add-on that we can have if we're rich enough. But actually, we've got more pressing needs like houses and so on, and we could just allow the environment to decline. What the Natural Capital Committee's done, and what lies behind the white paper, is the central notion that if you do not only hold the line, but improve our natural environment, economic growth in any serious measurement form will be going backwards. So put it the other way around. If you want sustainable economic growth, if you want people's prospects to increase, if you want opportunities to rise, you have to have the basic building blocks to make that happen. We understand that about energy, but sometimes we neglect it about water, and we neglect it about the sewage systems, etc. If you don't have that water infrastructure, you won't have the economic growth. It's very straightforward. So this isn't an add-on extra. This is core. And that's why the Natural Capital Committee reports to the Economics Committee of the Cabinet, and therefore the Treasury, rather than, although it works through DEFRA, to DEFRA. So getting that in the core is there. Now, just the final background to this is, so how does this all relate to the water sector? Well, if you want a 25-year plan, you have to think in 25-year terms. And if you want 25 years to work, you probably have to think of 30, 40 years within which the 25 years are set. So you have to take a long-term view. But here we have the water industry regulated on 5-year periodic reviews. Okay? And if you look at this periodic review, whatever one's views about the way the industry's financed and all the stuff about Thames, etc., and there are arguments to be had about that. Whatever you think about that, the really disjoint in policy is between the populist pressure to screw the bills down to the floor and have a pound of flesh taken out of the water industry now, and the obvious long-term needs to provide an infrastructure in the future which is fit for the task that's going forward. And those conflicts will always be there. There are good and bad arguments about what the rates of return, the cost of capital should be, the regulatory asset bases, the exact composition of the efficiency gains, etc. All of that's there. But if you want to think about how we are not going to have a degraded environment in the southeast so that our growth rates are lower, we want to think about how to take that forward. We have to find a way of breaking out of the 5-year periodic review regime. Now, there are lots of ways of doing that. This isn't the time to discuss them in fantastic detail, but let me just make a couple of pointers in the direction. If you look at the Cumbria Pioneer, and the idea is to take one river catchment, and it's a lot easier than the southeast to do, and just see how it works. It's pretty obvious that you want to integrate farming and farm subsidies, chemicals, etc., with flood defence, biodiversity upstream, and the quality of the water and the stuff that comes out of it. You can't do these in silos. You have to bring them together. And you have to have catchment plans which do this. You have to break down the common agricultural policy, and you have to get the kinds of things which Southern's done, Wessex is doing, others, start to get farmers to bid in to improve water quality and do those kinds of frames. And you have to do that in a way that integrates those things. You can't do that unless somebody's responsible for the coordination. And that's why, that's a personal view, not an MCC view, that's why I think we need catchment system operators, and to borrow that from the electricity industry, that's why I think we need these environmental components and the quality water issues auctioned. That's, I think, enhances competition in water catchments, but it brings coordination to the fore. And the lesson from the Pioneer in Cumbria, and it's not all good news in the way it's worked out, because the Pioneer, you get things wrong, but it's that absence of someone being in charge which makes it so difficult to coordinate these different component parts. And so when Michael Gove said the other day that he thought we need an Environment Protection Agency, a proper body to ensure environment standards were enforced after Brexit, no plus or minus in any of the, no interest in any of these bits and pieces. But actually, he's kicking off the starting game. What we have to think about is our very regulatory institutions, our environmental institutions, to make sure this longer-term, joined-up approach works. And that's the world in which the sorts of things that are in Peter's report really come to the fore, as opposed to being in a strict 5-year periodic review. That's some nice stuff, but that's beyond the next periodic review. We'll sort that out later. Well, the answer is we cannot afford, from an economic perspective, to simply say, let's leave it till later. This has to be integrated now, and we're right in the grips of this peer review, and the upside of this is this can be used as a framework to open this stuff up, to get a more sustained outcome. If we don't, well, the problems won't go away. The stuff in Peter's report will still be there, and he'll come and hit much harder and be much more expensive later. So that's the context in which this is set. 25-year plan's due in January. But hey, who do you think the Secretary of State will be in January? I've done 5. Maybe we'll be on number 6 by then, and we'll see what happens. Hope that helps.
Dieter, thank you very much indeed. I think perhaps Peter will pass the floor over to you to talk us through the document.
Thanks. Let me just say, first of all, thanks to Ian and to Bill and to Craig. I should also, David Smith's here as well, who we produced this together. I'm not the sole author, and I was about to call for Charlie's rescue then. So thanks and welcome, my own welcome. There won't be a test. I've tried to put together a few slides just to give you the highlights, just to pick up a few points that are not quite explicit in the report itself. So there is something a little bit new in what I'm saying here. This went to print about a month ago. The slight problem is you may not all be able to see this. I've got strict instructions on moving about. So there's a red line in my imagination just about there. This is apparently on Facebook now, so we're on stage a little bit. But let me just talk you through some of the highlights. The categories and the structure of this you're familiar with if you've even glanced at the report. But I'll state the obvious things, really. These are the kind of graphs you see all the time, population growth. Dieter's quite right to mention that specific problem or a challenge, but also actually a very good thing about the southeast is the population growth. You have food in the middle, though you won't be able to read that it's about food. And then you have growing energy demand as all these things accelerate into the sort of the 2050 period and beyond. So you all know that. There's no point in going really much further into that at all. What I want to do, though, is put some theory behind why we've produced this document in the way we have, because I think that may help. It puts it in a different kind of context to the context that Dieter's used. And incidentally, I agreed with everything that he said, of course. That goes frightening thought. We'll talk later about that. But let me just sort of go back to basics. There is a sort of concept, I specialize in thinking about the long term, in foresight, and stress how important it is. So obviously I welcome Dieter saying the sorts of things he did. But there are really basically, for any organization, and indeed any government, there are three basic questions you have to ask yourself. What might happen over whatever period you choose? We've chosen 2050. What might we do? In other words, what are your strategic options? Do we have a portfolio of options that we might use? And then what will we do? In other words, you've got to do something. You can't just actually talk about it. And the classic problem many governments have around the world, this is not particular to the UK, and many organizations have, is they may do some nice scenarios, but actually they never get to answer the next two questions. So they never get creative about what their strategic options are, and certainly never see it through. So there's very often a disjoint between the sort of, some people would call it the blue sky, and actually action. And that's very crucial. And yet everybody has an imagined future. We all have in our heads working models of how the next 30, 40 years will or may work out. And so it's fundamental to our whole psyche and to actually how we operate through in our lives. But essentially what we have to do is link the scenarios, the possible futures, to action. And that's essentially what sits behind this. And the ultimate test, a lot of people talk about resilience, and I think that is exactly the right word. But if you think about it, what are the tests of resilience? How do you know if you're successful and resilient? Well, actually, you have to start delivering hedging strategies that respond to the emerging risks, which are all around us, and some of them we've already touched on. The report goes into quite a bit of detail. But you've also got to accelerate the innovation, because you've got to keep up with things. You can't actually just think in terms of a passive, defensive position on these issues at all. You have to actually innovate to stay still. And I think Dieter's saying the same thing, slightly different language a moment ago. And so actually what you have to do is develop a portfolio of options, technically real options, that will work in all scenarios, even the most extreme. So whatever happens, even if we get very extreme stress to the water system in the southeast, which is indeed possible, then there has to be a set of working options that can be implemented as the signs of that becoming a reality actually crystallize. The theory behind this is work by Max Boiseau, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but we worked with him quite a bit. And essentially what the challenge is for any organization is to look at the external world, which is on the left of that picture. And we all know it's very complex. There's radical uncertainty. Mervyn King and many others now use the term radical uncertainty. It's beyond measurable risk. It's the unknown unknowns in Rumsfeld's terms. And it's accelerating very quickly. All human systems and the natural world are accelerating. So the world we're immersed in is actually much more difficult to navigate. From the company's point of view, you've got to match that world with what you know. It's essentially the knowledge and ultimately your inventive capacity. So you've got to invent to actually keep pace with the world that's changing around you. And so we're all in a position. You can argue that the financial markets got themselves into the extreme risk box there, where their understanding of what was going on was actually pretty weak. And yet the world was getting very complex. So you have to get to that point where if the world is indeed getting complex and moving faster and so on, you've got to stay on that diagonal, and actually best performance sits somewhere along that red line. That's being adaptive, that's being resilient in the terms we used a moment ago. The other way of looking at this is that you actually look very critically at what are the big impact factors that are going to shape the organizational context and the government's context and actually humanity's context, ultimately, if you look at it on a much broader stage. And this is simple stuff, but a lot of people fall into the simple trap of looking at impact and then worrying about things that are certain, things that are known. Actually, they don't shape the world. That's actually the easy part, because if you don't have a set of options for things you know are going to happen, well, God help you, really. That's kind of 101. What you really have to worry about is top right. In other words, things that are very, very uncertain, unknown unknowns and so on. And you've got to really work on those. And those actually form the backdrop to what we've started writing about in this document. So here's the picture that it's not clear there. If you've got the document in front of you, it's much clearer. So this is basically my script for the next 5 or 10 minutes. I'm just going to go through each of these sections and talk very briefly about each one, because I want a conversation, not for me to talk all evening. And we have some pretty strict timescales on that. So I'm now just going to talk about those six topics. These are defined in my terms as the high impact uncertainties. They're the top right in my previous diagram. That's what they are. They're not about what's a given. Some of the things are pretty given. I mean, demographics are there, but we should have options for that. It's relatively predictable. Some of these things are certainly not. So this is where we need to think much more creatively and openly about the future environment. So here's the first, and it's the most obvious. It's the backdrop to everything. And so, to my point earlier, what you have to start thinking about is, in one future, we have systemic shock at a very big scale, global scale. And everyone's beginning to think now 3 degrees, which is way beyond. If you remember when people started talking about 2 degrees, that was defined as dangerous. Now, it's generally accepted in Bonn, actually, recently, that we're heading to 3, unless there's fairly urgent action. And some people are saying 4. So what do you get there? Well, actually, obviously, you get runaway risks and systemic failure. So that's one extreme. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm certainly not predicting it. I'm saying that's a possible future. So we need to think about that. And in the southeast, as we all know, there's a vulnerability. There's probably a greater vulnerability than any other region in the country to actually those kind of extreme stresses that may emerge. At the other extreme, all climate actions and the natural Earth systems actually do create a 2-degree world, a much more benign outcome. And there are optimists who are actually making the case that human action now, belatedly, could actually achieve that. But I think it's an open question. And in any case, from the position of sort of government and Southern Water and all of us in the Southeast, we should be actually capable of thinking, well, what could we do if either of those extremes starts to emerge? The key, though, is that what happens in financial markets and in investment environments, and I don't need to tell Anthony this one particularly, is that the markets start moving when some idea of that imagined future crystallizes. So we've had examples of that where late last year, a lot of investors realized that there was a major change going on in fossil fuels and in transport particularly. And the pressures on BP and all the major oil companies suddenly increased. And it wasn't because next week BP was going to be in trouble. It was actually, there was a fundamental structural change going on that would impact them 10 or 20 years ahead. What's the commonality with Southern Water and infrastructure companies and utilities? They operate on similar long-term frames. They have to. Stranded assets is the classic sort of pivotal issue for anyone doing Ian and Bill's job. So that's why we need to think in those terms. So you get shocks in advance of a reality, if you see what I mean conceptually. So one of the ways of thinking about this is actually to think, as I talk about it here in ecosystem terms, this is a way of thinking. This is more about how knowledge works and mindsets and worldviews, which to me are actually pivotal. And yet there's great uncertainty. There are many people in this room that naturally will think holistically. I think most of you do, probably. But there are an awful lot of people that don't. Implementing that sort of thinking in institutional terms, which Dieter started talking about, is probably one of the pivotal questions. There's lots of research in Australia recently showing where they've tried to get institutional collaboration and coordination between siloed groups in order to make this kind of thinking work in practice. And so there's nothing new about ecosystem thinking. I've not invented something here at all. What I'm saying is that the real challenge is how to take those ideas and create the institutional collaborative thinking that in some ways perhaps we'll get into in a moment, and make it practical. How do you implement? How do you reconcile all those conflicting interests and vested interests and so on for the common good? And if there is one area where the common good is really obvious, it's in the water, energy, agriculture sectors. And let me stress that I do talk of water, energy, agriculture, and I also talk about transport less in this document, and I also talk about the need for urban planning. So there's the system. The system is not just catchment. So I'll slightly disagree here with Dieter, that actually you have to think about all those systems and the relationships between them. And only by doing that are you going to save massive costs in fresh investment and losses and ultimately failures in economic terms that Dieter did rightly talk about. But that's in doubt. Fragmented means siloed thinking carries on, and that's basically how much of our lives have been shaped over the last, many decades. So what is this about? It's about redefining how you collaborate at an institutional level in the Southeast, and I think that's my big challenge. And it is about integration, which everybody talks about, but actually how many effective macro-scale integrations have we seen in industries? It doesn't happen terribly easily, particularly in infrastructure. It happens very easily in an iPhone. iPhone's got 200 patents behind it. It's actually a huge collaborative design exercise to make something work. That's much more difficult in the infrastructure environment where your timescales are bigger, vast investment costs, lots of institutional complexity. So there is, in many ways, the big challenge. And I think people in this room are actually part of that. I think you've all got a part to play in that kind of collaborative thinking and how you can integrate for the common good. And I think that's key. One of the ways that happens is, fairly obviously, that the digital environment is being transformed at very, very high speed. The question, noise is off, I think that's called, isn't it? Certainly in the timescales we're talking about, to 2050, there will be, it's one of these things that's pretty predictable. There are huge risks about security, actually, on the Internet of Things. But let's just put that aside for the moment. Certainly in the sort of timescales we're talking about, we're going to see pervasive sensors, biosensors, labs on chips, people call them, devices that will sense everything about the environment, from the water quality to pollutants to air, everything. It's going to be a kind of sensor armor in a sense. And it will become very public. And in fact, that is one of the interesting questions, is how will the public start to respond when they realize that they're in a pretty polluted sort of area? Well, plastics most recently is a good example of where action's been taken, because suddenly everyone has thought, ooh, there's a lot of plastic in the ocean and that's not a good thing. There are lots more of those that are going to come into really sharp focus. And so the whole utilities industry, but water in particular, has to be ready for that transformation, which they'll be part of, because actually they'll be implementing these systems themselves and should be innovating rapidly in everyone's interest, including their own, to actually produce sensors that produce higher quality water and reduce the risks of pollution from agriculture right through to water processes themselves. But there's much more. So you can see very clearly precision agriculture is real in the US. It's almost the dominant theme. Precision agriculture means lots of technology, automation, robotic farms, mass scale US farming. Now, that won't happen, I don't think, in the UK and the Southeast, but parts of that innovation can be easily imported and leveraged to actually mean, to help reduce water consumption from agriculture. Bear in mind, globally, I forget the figure, something like 70% of fresh water consumption is agriculture. 15% roughly is energy, but 70%. So there's vast waste of water in agriculture everywhere, and it includes in this country, where you probably least expect it. So at one extreme, we get that rather rosy picture I was just started to describe. And in some ways, this is a relatively easy area of innovation for the industry as a whole, I think. These sort of integrations between water and energy, for example, using new battery technologies and so on, and solar power, radically better solar power, I should say, are relatively predictable. They're on the kind of, within 10-year timescales. There are lots of technologies that are already economic. Solar is reaching that kind of parity in many parts of the world already because of some price crashes. So if you were to say, well, this could go slowly and it's a patchwork, which is one extreme, or it's going to be mass automation and artificial intelligence pervading our environment, I think most people, certainly I would say, that's it's uncertain, but it's a little bit more predictable. Less predictable is nanotech and what happens here. So the great hope of nanotech is simply that the filtration system work at the right level, happily, for water. So you can filter out pollutants. You can revolutionize, basically, filtration at all scales. That means at very large plant scales, big installations that typically the water industry has invested and has to invest in heavily, but also at a micro scale. So it's not beyond our imagination to think of filtration at tap, as David and I would call it. In other words, filtration in the home at a level that gives you basically purity, or near purity, or certainly better water quality at the very least. And graphene, an invention actually out from Manchester University, ironically by Russians, they're already working on some of those filtration systems and pointing it specifically at desalination, because desalination is one of the big game changers. Here are some of the technological game changers, basically, certainly on the sort of timescales to 2050. Now, it could be incremental. We could go along slowly. But some estimates suggest that some of these technology are going to be market ready within a decade. So here again is the kind of dilemma for Ian is to, do we wait in investing in certain sort of, network infrastructures for water? Or do we invest heavily in big infrastructure in the same way? Do we pilot, for example, some of the most innovative and promising technologies and try them and build up expertise? And I think those are sort of some of the crucial and interesting questions that face not just Southern Water, but actually the water industry globally. There are dilemmas writ large. How do you time your entry into something that could change the game, but may not? How do you evaluate those sort of options? And that's back to my point about options. Finally, not quite finally, penultimate, really. The big question is really, how are public attitudes going to change? We didn't major on this in the document, but it's very clear that the younger generation, millennials don't want to be called millennials, so I won't call them millennials, people of a certain age, have quite different values to my generation. But do they? I think the interesting question is that a lot of the values, as far as the environment is concerned, are pretty widely shared. There's certainly a lot of research that points to wealthy younger generation, people who are inheriting big wealth all around the world, are investing a lot of their money in things about sustainability, about making the world a better place. They're investing effectively in an environmental agenda. And there's lots of figures on that. So I think that's kind of just a really interesting little illustration. Real money, private money, that is very entrepreneurial, comes often from entrepreneurial families, is heading straight into that area. So they buy the idea that they can actually revolutionize values over the long term. And so that raises a really interesting question of what's the tipping point of public attitudes? At what point do those sort of values of younger people particularly, but more broadly, when do they become much stronger and drive politicians and indeed utility companies to invest heavily, more quickly? Now, there's no answer to that. It's deeply uncertain. But I think it's a crucial question for everyone, and particularly for businesses. So that sort of is basically the contents of the book. We did, though, a lot of my work focuses on how on earth do you forecast? How do you forecast when something's going to sort of emerge, particularly new business models and new technologies? And I just want to give you a little glimpse. You won't be able to read the slide. This language is straight from the book, so there's nothing new. What is new is actually that little diagram that's microscopic and totally unintelligible. But the concept's actually really rather simple. If you look at the my voice is going, excuse me, 2 minutes before it should have done, really. Excuse me. If you look at the pattern landscapes, they do a really remarkable thing. You've got to have a lot of special skills to be able to look at them, I have to say. But if you look at the landscapes, you can say, well, here is an invention. Here somebody has done the work and there's a pattern, so you can read the pattern, it says what it does. And you can actually look at groups of patterns, they're called clusters, thickets in the most negative terms, where there's hotspots. So that sort of little blob on the right, that sort of elongated thing on the right with those little red blocks, there are lots of pattern activity, actually idea activity in this case. This is much more sophisticated than just the patterns. So what you have along the top are the market applications. This is actually about imaging. It's about agricultural imaging, as it happens. And you have technologies. So there's a lot of inventions in particular subsets there. But there's also, so you can forecast. You can say, well, there's a hotspot of invention, therefore 10 years on, we're going to see a new industry. So you can actually paint the picture. So some of that's actually in the report. Part of the way I've done that is I've looked at where the hotspots are. And you can do that in tremendous depth. But there's also much more interesting, there are things called white spaces, where actually there's a market need, and there are some obvious ones in this area. But there are very few inventions. And that's where it gets really interesting, because if you look at it from a commercial point of view, that's where people change industries. And that's how you reinvent the world, is actually not through everybody jumping into the same hotspot area and fighting over it and squabbling over patents and so on. You look for the white space. And I think there's a real argument in this industry, particularly at the intersection of water, energy, agriculture, to look at white space. So, with voice now gone, I think, Anthony, would you like to sort of now pick up what you can from that? But for the moment, I'll remain silent. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter. I should say that although we are awash with microphones, they're not broadcasting anything. They're for the recording and the transmission. So if you are at one end of the table, basically your voice is going to have to transmit to the other end of the table so they can hear. So if you could all speak rather more loudly than perhaps you normally do, it would obviously allow everybody to share in what's being said. Now, what I want to do first is just go quickly around the table to give you all a chance to introduce yourself and a very quick reaction to the report as to whether you think it's useful or not. But really only a 1 minute from each, because there are 20 of you around here, and it'll take half an hour to get round, by which time the first one will have lost the will to live. So I think it's important that we keep that briefly to the point. And then I'm going to focus on, first of all, is there anything that's been missed out that we really ought to put on the agenda for Southern Water? And then after that, we'll move into more detail to discuss the points that Peter has outlined and try to put them in context. So I think as a first off, it's probably best to, I should say as well that I have vaguely grouped you into I hesitate to say like-minded souls, but into, if you like, political and local government, regulation in its widest sense, industry and farming in its widest sense, and the environment, and the consumer interest on the end. This is largely for my purposes, so that I vaguely know whether each segment is getting a fair share of exposure or not, which I wouldn't do if you were randomly around the table. It doesn't mean to say you have to agree with those next to you, quite the opposite. And it doesn't mean to say you have to feel you're categorized by those next to you either, but it's just really for my convenience. So if I may, can we start at the far end there with Anne and work our way around the table just very quickly so everybody can say who they are, so all of you know where everybody's coming from, and move on then Anne and sorry.
Okay, so I'm Anna Bradley. I chair the Customer Challenge Group at Southern Water for this price review, and actually I chaired it for the last price review. Our role is to help and then ultimately comment to Ofwat on the way the company engages with customers and stakeholders and builds their priorities into the plan. And I would say about the report, that I know that the Customer Challenge Group hugely welcomes this longer-sighted perspective, because even without the kind of imagining conversations that are described in this report, what customers and stakeholders, but perhaps more surprisingly customers, are saying is that they're interested in the really long term, and they want to know that that's being addressed, not just tomorrow.
Thank you. Jeff?
I'm Jeff Raw, I'm Chief Executive of Brighton and Hove City Council. Working very closely with Ian now. We set up something called the Greater Brighton Economic Board a couple of years ago. We've asked Ian to chair a group looking at producing an energy and water plan. I think fundamentally what that underpins is economic growth in the region, but it also is going to have to address how do we engage with communities, and Ian ultimately and the team that we're trying to put around him is going to be reporting both to a part of the board which is business orientated, but also has the political leaders from the local authorities.
Thank you. Julia?
Julia Gregory, I'm Director of Projects from Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. For us, obviously, hugely topical to have this document at this point in time. Our key issue is how do we grasp the huge opportunity that is there for a garden city, but we need to grasp it in the very short term to enable the planning for the long term. So that's why we're very much working very closely with both Southern Water and our other water companies that are in the area now to make sure that we realise that opportunity for the future. So.
Thank you. Anne?
Anne McIntosh, currently in the Lords, where I'm co-chair of the Water Group. We're looking also separately at water and housing inquiry. I took the title of Pickering because I was closely involved in the Pickering Slow the Flow project, which was very much a partnership approach. And I think catchment system management is great, but I don't quite understand what the Secretary of State is getting at with having this new body. I think there should be no one size fits all, but choose an organisation. It could be a water company, it could be a drainage board, locally to manage each catchment. I think there is going to be an opportunity through the Agriculture Bill and the Environment Bill in preparation for us leaving the European Union to actually really link agriculture and environment going forward. And I think there should be one 25-year plan for agriculture and environment.
Interesting, thank you. Ian?
Bill.
Bill, sorry. That's it. Bill.
Hi, Bill Tame. I'm
Right,
chairman
right,
of.
it's very small.
It is very small. Have we swapped places here? Bill Tame, chairman of Southern Water Board, relative newcomer to the water industry. I try and strike a balance between the interests of Southern Water, the interests of regulators, and the interests of investors. Although I know my remit is limited in that regard, but what is of interest to me in this report, none of which I would disagree with, is how you make it happen. And ultimately it comes down to ownership, regulation and economic incentives, and I don't see a solution to that yet, and that's what worries me a little bit about getting this executed.
Peter and Ian and Dieter you've heard from. Oh, so you swapped, yes. Right.
I'm David Smith, Strategy Officer at MWH, now part of Stantec. So we worked with Peter on the production of this report. I think just a quick comment I'd make is we agonised long and hard over the 6 key areas that we focused on in the report, and there's a lot behind each one. And with the increasing complexity and the need for long-term thinking, I think the example I'd use is that collaboration redefined one. How we have to do things very differently. Collaboration is a kind of overused word, but we added redefined because it really does need joined up thinking across everything to be able to really solve this. So I like your point on agriculture and environment. I think it absolutely has to be joined up, and be that at community or at city or at regional level. That's the challenge that we face. So I just use that as one example. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We're moving into the regulatory space now. Claire.
Thank you. I'm Claire Forbes from Ofwat, the economic regulator. And I think just to echo what's been said in terms of the different strands that this report pulls together and the integration of that, I think is key. Anybody who is any contact with Ofwat at the moment will know that innovation and resilience are 2 of our watchwords. Particularly, we like to talk about resilience in the round. And I think this report kind of very successfully articulates some of the challenges that the sector's facing on both those issues.
Okay. Manuel?
Manuel Di Mauro from the National Infrastructure Commission, and our role is really to advise government to provide recommendations to government on what is the level of investment that needs to go to infrastructure and how to meet the challenges, some of the challenges that are set in this report. So absolutely, we embrace the key pressure that are underlying the report in terms of climate, population, environment. Absolutely embracing long-term view and the importance of technology. That's something that the Commission is quite keen on pushing forward. One of the main issues that I think we really need to tackle with this report is the so what do we do? And I don't want to underplay the uncertainty, but there is quite a lot of information, quite a lot of data, especially if you're looking at fairly short term on 2050, but all the tools that we have to make decision making under uncertainty. So we can make strong decisions now, and I think we should make them, and not just on water resources, but also on flooding and surface water is one of particular area we are very worried about.
Thank you. And Marcus?
Yes, hi. My name is Marcus Rink, and I'm from the Drinking Water Inspectorate. My interest is maintaining the high standard of water quality that we're fortunate to have in this country. I'm very, very keen on this report because I think that if you spend time at catchment and you get it right, then as the drinking water quality regulator, we benefit. And in fact, everybody benefits because it's easier to treat, it's cheaper to treat, and it provides a better quality water to start with and end up with. I have been for some time talking about the long-term thinking within the water industry. It is a heavily asset-based industry, and you have to keep investing in that asset base to maintain the water quality and the ever-increasing challenges. It's important to look towards the future for the reasons that were given in terms of water availability and water resources, because as those become much, much more scarce, the challenges for water quality increase. And so we've got to keep a close eye on our way going forward for 25, 30, 40 years.
Jim.
I'm going to stand up because I can't see people otherwise, so you certainly can't see me. James Humphreys from the Environment Agency. I'm sorry I've got a cold. I read this, probably like many of you, and I thought, gosh, that's got a lot of moving parts. That's quite complicated. And that's, even having had the benefit of Ian and others explain this to me some time back. And the only observation I want to make about this is it comes back to Bill's point about how we're going to do this. This is hugely complicated, and it involves an awful lot of things for us to think about. So I hope that we will remember the old adage of think global, act local. Because if we don't do that, we're going to think a lot about this, but we're not going to actually make progress on the ground. So somehow we need to focus this down, all these great ideas, focus this down, so that we've got something we can achieve, at least regionally, if not even more locally than that, at catchment level, as we've just been hearing. Because that's what worries me. It's just too big. Maybe my brain's too small.
Thank you. I think at the end, two members of the home team, is it Craig?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Craig Loney, I'm Director of Strategy and Regulation at Southern Water. I also have previous as a regulator. I was a Director of Ofcom for several years. For me, one of the things that we wanted to try and flush out with this report was to surface different forms of uncertainty that are going to be a prominent feature of the world that we're working in. The regulatory system that we're all used to and have worked in is very rule-based and is somewhat inflexible, and some might argue is somewhat institutionalized in that certainty-driven approach. And what this sets out as a world in which regulators probably need to adapt to be more open to uncertainty and perhaps entering worlds of grey rather than black and white.
Richard?
Sorry. Good evening, I'm Richard Price. I'm the Director of Engineering and Construction at Southern Water. So I'm busily delivering today's assets to meet the needs of our customers in the immediate future. This report is fascinating in terms of the change and the world that we're living in, and the changes that are coming towards us. This is happening. So I'm fascinated by the innovations that will be available to us to meet the resilience challenges that we need to ensure the services are provided to our customers.
Well, we are now into the agricultural industrial units, shall we say. Paul?
Yes, hello, I'm Paul Hammett. I have Water Resources Lead for the National Farmers Union. I was pleased to see so much emphasis within the report on the relationship between the water, energy and agricultural sectors. I'm particularly pleased to see, I think, agriculture framed in a way that it can be a solution rather than a problem to the way that we're going forward. I was pleased to see, with the NFU developing its own vision for where we will be as a sector over the next 20 years. It's comforting to find common linkages in some of what I read. It occurred to me that with a focus on research going forward at the behaviour of consumers. Consumers of water are also consumers of food. And I'd like to think there are allegiances that could be made there and linked up thinking on that. And I guess one of the current themes emerging around the table, an emphasis on catchment. I think farmers are really important to the catchment ideas. And my plea on that would be that detail is so important. If catchment ideas are to be successfully delivered by the farmer and the regulator, then it needs very careful thought, or else things can go terribly wrong.
Sorry.
Evening, James Hope from UK Power Networks, the local energy company. So I guess the report is raising quite a lot of interesting points in the relationship between water, energy and, as you say, farming. I think as a distribution company, I think the points that are raised in terms of uncertainty and the different sort of new technologies that could come about and are actually coming about, there are many parallels in the electricity sector. So in some ways it's unfortunate that Dieter's had to leave. I think as an ex-regulator, the licensees, companies quite often talk about uncertainty, and I think the talk of boiling it down to some practicalities. So we have our price control coming up in a few years' time, and we're already engaging with our regulator on what that sort of framework should look like. And I think the report is interesting as far as it goes, and it's not criticism, it's trying to understand then how does that interplay with PR19 and understanding how the regulatory framework will enable lots of the good stuff to come about, which doesn't quite silo it and make it so it has to be business as usual, provides the right sort of incentives, but at the same time does provide the right sort of customer protections so that you do have that balance between the certainty and the flexibility. And I think trying to understand how that then interplays with the energy side of things and the plans that we need to put together, so that when you're talking whole system, is it lower costs in one sector with more investment in another? I think that will be interesting to see how it comes together.
Alex.
Right, Alex Vaughan. I'm Managing Director responsible for natural resources within Costain. So we're a supply chain partner for Southern Water, providing infrastructure services. And our job is to make sure that we're ahead, able to bring innovation and support our customers. So it's really good to see this report. It's really good to see some long-term thinking in there, and I think we all can see the pace of innovation and change and the benefits that will bring to the solutions that we put in place. But I think probably the thing that really caught my eye, and I've seen outside of this group, I've seen it go into practice, is this whole ecosystem thinking and collaboration. And I've seen retailers and water companies come together and have some really powerful conversations around actually how jointly some of these big challenges can be tackled proactively. So I see that as a real positive opportunity for us moving forward.
Thank you. And Duressa.
I'm Duressa Frodsham. I'm the Director of Water and Environment for Ricardo. We are also part of the supply chain for Southern Water. And one of the areas that we work in quite extensively in the UK is the catchment management and water resource planning. So it's very much natural environment. We're also part of a bigger company who are automotive and very high tech. And I think there's some opportunities there to join the two together, and that's where I'm looking at the moment. So I was delighted when I read this report because it touched on the sort of strategy that we are now pursuing in terms of agriculture, wastewater and energy all together. And I think one of my real concerns, I have two, I probably have more, but two. One is, how does this really fit with the sort of current imperatives coming from the regulatory regime of Ofwat in both timescale and also emphasis? So I've been at the Water 2017 conference today, and some of the messaging that was coming there I felt was quite different to this. There's very much a focus on delivering very cost-effective solutions which will drive down our customers' bills. How does that all fit into this? So I think in terms of what's missing, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. And I think the other element in terms of concerns is the pace of change. And we've been talking about catchment management in water industry for a long, long time. It's not really biting. It's spoken about, it's discussed at the board level, but making it happen on the ground, I think, has been very slow. So I think the pace of change probably links to the last item on cultural and social change. And I think very often we underestimate that. We underestimate that on the people who are going to deliver this. We underestimate that in terms of the behaviours required to go out and engage with farmers and other stakeholders, which hasn't been the norm for water companies. There has been a tendency to not let people know till we have the fully formed solution. So really, really great report and lots in it, lots to go at.
Abby.
Hello, hi, Abby Morris from the CBI. Just say thank you. It's an excellent and timely report, and it really does align with exactly our current thinking. The resilience decisions need to be taken today via a whole systems approach. So definitely along the lines, and I can't wait to see what the final plan is.
The last cohort, largely environmentally associated, on my immediate left, is it Nathan or Nat?
Nathan.
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. And two excellent reports, I should say, because I think the Let's Talk Water was really good as well. I'm Deputy Chair of Blueprint for Water, and we're a coalition of 17 environmental NGOs who come together to try and talk bit more in a bit more of a joined up way around water issues. A couple of quotes sort of jumped out to me when I read through the report, and they were around complex systems becoming fragile when they get fragmented, and when they're difficult to understand, and the systems can get stressed when there are too many interconnections and too many moving parts. And I have a sort of personal concern, you could say, about the direction of the water industry, in that, to me, as a stakeholder, it does seem to be becoming more fragmented, with retail being separated off, potentially domestic customers, water resources, biosolids. You know, are we actually losing the ability to join things up and actually heading in the wrong direction? Would be my challenge.
Thank you. Will?
I'm Will Andrews Tipper, Head of Natural Environment at Green Alliance, the environmental think tank. There's lots to really like about this report. I'll just make a couple of points about innovation. I think the first point is it's not just about technology. I think accounting frameworks and certainly business models are two areas which are equally ripe for disruption and potentially could deliver results fairly immediately. The other point is there's a lot of emphasis in here about place-based innovation, so whether it's catchment level or city level. But I think thinking in terms of value chain innovation is equally important in terms of linking up global users of water and the products created by water is a fundamental part of transforming how we use those resources.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine Moncrief from WWF. I'm a freshwater...
Sorry, you're going to have to speak up,
okay.
I'm afraid. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm Catherine Moncrief from WWF. So, yes, very happy to see this report and that we are thinking long term. That's very welcome. And there were things in there which really jumped out at me as somebody that is supporting the environment and trying to protect our rivers. There were lots of good things in there, particularly about the links between ecosystems and human systems and how it's important to make those links, the emphasis on long-term views, the emphasis on making sure we're understanding people's views, how those views are changing, the narratives that are emerging. But a bit of a concern. The report was quite cerebral. Maybe I'm not clever enough, but I found it a bit difficult to really understand in some places exactly where it was driving. And so I think, as others have alluded to, there's quite a jump that we need to do in order to actually put these things into action. And many around the room have said that we are working in a regulatory framework which is on a 5-year cycle and that is quite fixed. I mean, it's moving in the right direction, but it is quite fixed. And so I'm just concerned, how do we take this sort of quite cerebral thinking and move it forward under the current regime that we're working with?
Thank you. Debbie.
Hi, I'm Debbie Tan. I'm the Chief Exec of the Wildlife Trusts for Hampshire and Isle of Wight. I actually wrote some of the Natural Environment White Paper that Dieter Helm referred to earlier. I worked in DEFRA in 2011. So some of those ideas about long-term thinking and catchment solutions, you know, in the environmental sphere, we've been talking about this for a very long time. So it's great to see the industry picking this up. What we really like is the emphasis on collaboration, on integration. As an ecologist, that's absolutely my bread and butter, so it's really great to see that. Very practically though, and I agree with James and Kat, you know, I want to see delivery on the ground. I think as a charity and as a landowner locally, we can do some of that. We've been managing Testwood for 25 years. Testwood is one of the collaboration projects, transformational projects here in this report. I want to work with Southern Water and deliver something really interesting down there. We can have more water, we can have a better environment and actually deliver something practical to demonstrate what's possible. So we're up for that sort of approach. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of stuff in here around the possibility of desalination. That may well come in the southeast. You know, are the public ready for that? I think we've got quite a long way to go in terms of selling those ideas to the public. But what we're really interested in is leading catchment solutions, demonstrating stuff on the ground, what's possible, because some of the solutions are simple as I think in the report, some of it isn't that costly, and actually some of it's a bit of a no-brainer. So that's our role, is to deliver good stuff on the ground and show what's possible. So thank you, Ian, for inviting us to take part.
And finally, Steve, I think you deserve a round of applause for your patience.
I know, you built up. I've got to finish with a bang. Yeah, I'm Steve Harron, the Chief Executive of Age UK East Sussex, and also a CAP member of Southern Water. I thought the report was really, I mean, it did what it was intended to do, which was to get us thinking and have that longer term view. I really welcomed that. Even the bits that excited me, but I didn't really understand. So nanotechnology, I think is, I think I was really struck on reading that passage in particular, how the optimism versus pessimism in these things is always kind of key. And you go back to kind of, will there be enough food to feed the world when Thomas Malthus in the 18th century? It's kind of, there's a lot of stuff in there that says actually technology has a part to play. What was most important for me, though, is this focus on, as some of the colleagues have said, about the kind of the ecosystem thinking and the kind of purpose and the ability to collaborate in perhaps in ways we couldn't imagine. What for me is slightly missing through some of this is the kind of the customer as an active citizen, and whether that's a citizen of their community, of their catchment management area, or of an identity which is not about geography. So is there something about kind of customers as citizens of the world that we need to think in when we talk about kind of the values and the vision and some of the change of behaviours we want to see as part of a solution?
Splendid. Well done. Thank you, everybody. Now, there were various points made as we went round of things that you felt were or could have been played up more or weren't in there. But is there anything that hasn't been discussed that people really think should be in there? Now would be the time to flag it. Otherwise, we'll assume that we've covered the universe, even if we haven't got the answers. One point, Anne.
I don't know where it would have fit, because I do agree it was on a different level to which I normally operate as the legislature. But I think developers should be made...
modest people. Can I just... a lot of very modest people. Of course you understood all this.
Time will tell. Developers should be made to pay for big developments, and
You're seeing this, or
well, it's just we go back to all these reports that we've done, and we've exercised the K review on competition. We haven't done the Walker review on water efficiency, and we don't seem to have done much in the way of ending the automatic pit review in the floods 10 years ago, ending the automatic right to connect, which is a fairly basic thing. Don't expect water companies to have to supply to major developments if they can't. And if you're going to build on a site that takes displaced water, that water is going to go to an existing development. So, sort of where are the developers in all this and actually making them pay? SUDs, I think we've got to do a lot of retro, sort of finding out where they are, who's responsible for them. I think going forward, sort of in the future, then I think they're relying more on SUDs, which is good. But I just think that we're missing a trick in, I don't think there was ever a critical assessment done of, I don't think there was ever an audit done nationally of critical infrastructure after the 2007 floods, and we keep building still on floodplains, and at some point the developer is going to have to pay, so that when they go away and there is a future flood in that area, they've already picked up the tab for that and it's not passed on to future homeowners.
Mm.
And I don't know where in the report it would go. The other political point I would make is that there is a point at which customers will squeal if they're asked to pay too much. And we used to see that as MPs in our postbag, sort of emails now, but postbag before. And I think if you look at energy bills now, all the renewables is coming home to roost. And I have to say, it is rather perverse of a government to say it wasn't us that imposed them; it was a previous government. But you realistically, you put on these renewable obligations to customers, and then at the end of the day, they're going to turn around and they can't afford to pay it. And I think with water companies the same. I mean, what the elephant in the room that no one has mentioned is that if the result of this general election was repeated in 4 years' time, you will see a change of government. There is going to be a change of government at some point. Water companies will be renationalised. It is out there, and how is all this going to be paid for? And I think that's something that's a known unknown or an unknown known.
It's a known unknown.
And I think sort of water companies have to start planning for it now. The other, I mean, all the obligations that we've signed up to, which I know was a lot of pressure from the Green Lobby, I would go beyond the NUP. There was also the I forgot the Quality of Life, which is a very good read as well. If anybody hasn't read that, but there are revisions to the directives going on as we speak in Brussels. I think it's the Drinking Water Directive, the Wastewater Directive. Are we going to sign up to these? Will they be agreed before we leave the European Union? Are we going to ask water companies today, as part of this present price review, to sign up to them, or are we just going to say, we're going to keep to what we've already agreed?
Much uncertainty there. Mind you, if Corbyn does win, then we don't have a money problem, do we, at all? I'll come to you in a second, but points down this end from the Marcus and both of you. Yeah, Marcus.
Yeah. The report examines a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts, and it has had to put an awful lot of information into what is a relatively short report. So yeah, I understand where there is some difficulty in fitting everything, and I'm sure you understand that I probably will come from the water quality angle. It goes without saying. The point made about some of the directives, particularly with the environmental directives and the drinking water directives, is that there's a recognition that there needs to be a stronger link, that one inevitably affects the other. And looking at drinking water in the water in the environment affects drinking water. And it's alluded to here in terms of technologies and technology advances. It talks about desalination and so on. But I would like to see a stronger link with water quality and how and why some of these advances are being put in place to deal with the diminishing resource and the increasing challenges of demographics, climate and population.
Thank you. James.
I was just going to add that although this report is in many respects about big stuff and therefore one shouldn't focus in too much geographically, if I were a resident of Portsmouth or Southampton, I'd feel a little neglected in this report. 833,000 people, 6th largest conurbation in the country. So if we're going to situate this and give it context, the Southern Water context, I think that might need a little bit more of a mention because it's big.
Fair point. I'll go to Anne and then to you.
I just want to pull together a number of threads about people, because if there was one thing I felt was missing, it is people. And I was really glad that you mentioned, Peter, particularly young people, because I think that needs to be plugged in very fully. But I also think the point that Steve was making about active participants is absolutely critical, and I think there's an opportunity here. So one of the things that in all of the work that Southern have been doing with customers and stakeholders that they've heard really, really strongly from customers is that they want to play their part. They recognise many of these challenges. They don't understand them all, but they recognise the challenges that the South East is facing, and they want to play their part. Unfortunately, given water usage, one of the surprising things in this report is that actually domestic usage is a very small part of overall water demand. But agriculture, as we've heard, is a very major part, and this much more integrated approach, bringing together agriculture, energy and water, will make a great deal more sense of what people can do to people themselves, because that's how they experience their lives. They don't experience it as just water or just energy or just agriculture. It's all the things they do in their homes which have an impact on the world around them. And this report, I think, creates an opportunity for much more active participation, even if just as consumers and not as broader citizens, around the choices you make, not just about water, but also particularly about the food you eat and the way that your choice of foodstuffs could have a huge impact, if that was followed through into agriculture, on the usage that agriculture makes of water. So I think it's an opportunity to have a different kind of conversation with the public, which is a really good thing.
Claire, Ofwat, do you want to do that?
Yes, thank you. I first want to say I agree with what Anna was saying, and I think that the content of this report really does beg the question of how you have the conversation with customers and actually how you present to them the choices that they need to make between sort of services now, paying for services in the future, that kind of long-term intergenerational resilience, I think is really key. But I think, Anthony, the question that you asked was what was missing. And we've been around the table and there's a fantastic group of people here, but I think what's missing for me are where are the other water companies? Because actually no water company can deliver this alone. And so the question I would ask is, where's the collaboration, not just between transport and water and infrastructure, but where's the collaboration between the water companies that's going to tackle some of these issues?
That's a question for you, Ian.
Yeah, I don't want to stress, because it's the classic response of what's missing, what's not here, what we're not covering. Remember what Peter said at the outset. This report was merely meant to cover what might happen. It's not meant to provide solutions. It's not meant to provide absolute detail. It's about stimulating thought. It's also for me, as a water company CEO, I mean, I've spent 35 years of my life working in water and the environment all around the world. I've worked in some water-stressed countries. I've lived in America, in Colorado, and I've never in my life come across some of the scenarios that we have in the southeast in the UK as well. So it was really meant to stimulate that what might happen there. And then from this, getting this collective wisdom that we have around the table, it's the biggest time of change. So then we need to move to the, well, what might we do? And who needs to be in the room? And one of the things I was really keen on tonight was to get people in the room who could really start to stimulate that thinking. The other point I really want to stress as well is that when people talk about water, they tend to look to water companies. I don't. We are a subordinate part of the water environment in the southeast. So we have a part to play, but we are not the answer. And there's an enormous amount of pushback towards customers, something Anne and I talk about, something I talk about with Ofwat. If I look at the southeast region, and one of the biggest telling points for me was I walk the beach with my partner and wife every weekend. And when we moved down in January, the beach was empty. It was our beach. The first weekend, a warm weekend in April, early April, which for a Scotsman was quite interesting to have warm temperatures in early April. All of a sudden, I think most of London landed on Brighton Beach. And therefore, it changed my thought of, it's not just about customers of Southern Water, it's customers of the water environment as well. Because the economic returns, as Jeff will tell you, from having high quality drinking waters, high quality beaches, are way beyond the turnover of Southern Water or what our direct customers pay. So getting away from the water utilities and much more towards the utility of water and the value of water going forward in the future is really one of the things that we are driving at as a company. And me as an individual, I have 4 kids. I want to make sure that the water environment I leave behind for them is one that they'll be able to utilise going forward for many, many years. So it's much wider, it's much bigger. We're not trying to do this from a Southern Water perspective, as I said. We're trying to do it from a, how do we get that value of water realised into the future?
Well, can we pick up on that and see what we can do to nail it? I mean, one of the most interesting things in the report, I thought, was the ecosystem and the collaborative space. If we could perhaps talk about those together and really talk about the possibility of collaboration and managing that ecosystem and what it actually means. And I always like to ask who's going to be boss. But in a case, who's going to be boss comes, in a way, secondly, but how is it going to be driven forward? Whose job is it that's going to be to bang heads together or initiate the cooperation, and how would it be structured? So, Bison, to start with.
Okay, so just to try and answer that question, so we're going to try and practically do this with Ian. I suppose we're a bit of a test case in that we have something called Greater Brighton Economic Board. It doesn't cover all of Southern Water's territory, but we have a board which is made up of politicians who have some local democratic representation. They're there to represent the people, and we have business leaders as well who are potential consumers as well of water resources, Ian said. And what we find is a sort of common theme, and interestingly going back to the point about will a future Corbyn government nationalise the industry, my guess is that you'll still end up with a public-private partnership investment of some sort. That quite how it's what it is, I don't know. Who knows what will happen? But you will end up with combinations of public and private investment. I think that's one of the problems that we have in the UK about generally how does public and private money come together. We get into very ideological positions, I think. I think it's interesting to see whether we can unpack that. If I still have a question, and I think Ian was saying that this is not the time when we're going to be able to have all the answers. One question I do have, which I was thinking about on the train coming up, is actually what happens in the business model in the water industry, which I think that's one of the questions I've heard being grappled with. Because if you can understand how that business model changes, or what it is at the moment and what it might move to, I think other partners, other players in that can then understand how do they relate to it. So if, talking about energy, point someone was from UK Power Networks was making to me on your chief exec on Friday, you've gone from an economic situation where there were 8 providers, is it 2.5 million now? The whole way in which energy generation has been has developed has changed. Is starting to change the business model. What's the equivalent in the water industry? And I don't know that yet. I'm learning, listening, but it seems to me in that context how public and private investment comes together under the auspices of local democratic control in my world. Perhaps it's national at other levels, and where do businesses and consumers get represented? That you need forums to do that. I think we're trying to create an example with the Greater Brighton area to see whether we can arrive at a solution to those business problems and the local democratic issues that it raises as well. So maybe we can beat a path to a solution. If I could I just add a sort of general point?
And then Nathan.
Just briefly, that one of the sort of starting points of earlier work we did on this was to say, is it possible that there will be mass decentralization of water in a similar way to, in fact, has been already achieved in energy? And the answer was yes and no. And so, we've tended to use the expression of distributed networks where there are large installations and small installations, and it's very localized. As you said, it's very particular to an area. It's not necessarily, as I think you and several other people have said, not necessarily about a catchment. It's what works for that particular sort of geographical area and for, as Ian was saying, for all other users of the environmental services, effectively. So these are really tricky and complex problems, but I think the idea of localization technically is going to get easier in general. If there's a direction of travel in the technology, certainly it's localized.
Good. Nathan, you...
Yeah, I was just going to give a plug for multi-sector planning in the water sector. So traditionally, water companies have done their water resource planning sort of independently, almost of each other. Over the last 5 years, we've seen things like Water Resources South East, where the companies are sort of talking to each other and trying to come up with more joined-up solutions. But I think we can take it a step forward and actually look at planning across multi-sectors for water, across energy, agriculture, the environment and water supply, to try and identify or get on the same page in terms of the future challenges, but also try and identify options and solutions that can deliver benefits for multiple sectors rather than just the water sector.
But whose job would it be to make that happen, to actually start that process? To get all, even just get all the water.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the initiative I've been involved with in the east of England, that was one of the water companies took the initiative, put in a bid, got some agreement to fund a project. But there's a debate now about what happens in the next phase of that project. Is it just all going to dwindle away? Where does the money come from? Should it be shared amongst the companies and the other sectors?
Is it something the regulator should do?
I think we would certainly collaboration between companies and tackling some of these issues is something that we would welcome, because we recognise these issues are so big and they're not boundaried according to water company boundaries. Of course, they're not. So absolutely, we would see that, and what we would see, I think, in terms of what consumers are expecting, customers are expecting going forward, it's a greater integration of services, and that was one of the things talked about this morning at Water 2017 at the conference about actually what's the utility landscape going to be like in 10 years' time, and it may not be water, energy, telecoms, or whatever, but actually a much more fluid and integrated kind of landscape there.
But I mean, to Bill's point right at the beginning, financial incentives tend to make things happen. Now, I mean, could DEFRA, for example, Ofwat, as part of its settlement, insist that there's more cooperation among water companies, or coordination? Cooperation sounds kind of anti-competitive, but coordination.
I don't think that Ofwat would want to prescribe the way that happens, but I think what you will see is that there are greater financial incentives for water companies to tackle things like innovation, to tackle these issues of resilience that we're talking about. So absolutely, that's something which is a feature of the price reviews coming up, and indeed we're looking ahead to 2024.
And I take your point, but innovation and so on tend to be at a company-wide level, not, as we're talking about, at a system-wide or even a regional level.
And that's part of the conversation that I think the sector as a whole needs to have. There are various initiatives where that's happening, but yeah, absolutely, you're right.
Can I just come in there?
Yes, do.
I think that will happen, and I think that will happen in terms of coming up with initial solutions. My concern would be the longevity and structurally, how do you maintain those solutions if they across NGOs and charitable organisations when Ofwat really are funding or controlling the funding of the water companies. So it's much easier to do it with the water companies, but the collaborative solutions may run for 2 or 3 years. But what happens, and how do you prop that up or make that structurally sustainable? That would be my concern.
Okay, actually, could I just bring a farming view in here, and indeed the electricity view, that the energy view, that you should be part of any of this kind of system-wide planning. So how do you see it working? How do you see it being initiated so that it actually gets legs?
Well, my only experience of that is Nathan's already described the project in the east of England that agriculture has been fully engaged in as well. I think that, and it's important that these sorts of ideas are promoted for multi-sector solutions. I'm always conscious that with it, the nature of my sector is that farms are small, if not micro businesses, quite fragmented. So it takes a while to get everybody up and running. But that's simply an issue to overcome. But we're certainly fully engaged with ideas around multi-sector infrastructure, bulk transfers.
It presumably wouldn't come at local farm level, would it? It would be government level that would drive something like this in agriculture?
Well, I think that farms are businesses, and farmers are adaptable, and if opportunities come up to do things other than just grow food, for example, hold water for the benefit of others. I'm sure that not all, but many farmers will be interested in those opportunities.
Yep. Yes, right. Sorry, multiple of hands. Can we come down this end for the environment for a second? Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to talk about planning and to pick up the point about developers. I think what we're seeing at the moment, and forgive me if this is a little bit controversial, but I think the planning system is totally dysfunctional at the moment. What we're finding is that we've got local authorities with no plans, no adopted local plans in place. So what happens is you have developers coming forward, no strategy, very little join up with the water companies. Housing developments being put forward, water companies have to then provide the water regardless. So that whole system there, I believe, is flawed. If we could sit back and work much more proactively, as you're describing, with the local authorities, to plan ahead what development's coming over the next 20 years, because actually it's a bit of a free-for-all right now, because I think the planning system is broken. So for me, there's a really important point there about working properly with the planning system so that we know what's coming, rather than the water companies having to react to poorly planned and, quite frankly, opportunistic developments coming forward.
Actually, we didn't get the electricity view particularly, did we, on how the energy view and how cooperation might work?
It's like an answer.
If you're talking cooperation across licensees, certainly within electricity, the regulator has put certain things in place over the last price control or two for us to collaborate, innovate, where historically our funding is generally from the customers in our particular license area, but Ofgem has put certain things in place whereby all customers across the UK will contribute and licensees will do innovation, but they are required to then share the learning of that innovation with other licensees. So it's an interesting change to some of that regulatory framework where historically it's been very much the regulators looked at each licensee to develop its plans, reveal what can be efficient costs, better levels of service, and then taken those at the next price review and pass those benefits to customers, to one where you are starting to share and collaborate across companies. But at the same time, those pressures on bills and actually then, well, how do I retain a competitive advantage if I'm explaining to everybody else how it is that I'm doing things? Then when you come to water sector and how can electricity and water interact, I think it does then partly come down to the regulatory framework, like it or not. Licensees are funded by customers, and for licensees to do particular things, they need to be clear on, well, is that in our remit to be able to do it, or is it a supplier? Or actually, where does the boundary come between the water company and the electricity company? I think put the right regulatory framework in place and the right sort of incentives, and quite often licensees can respond to those challenges. But I think it does need some direction from regulators such that licensees are clear in the space in which they're operating in, and then that can be clearly articulated to customer groups as to exactly what is being put forward by the companies. So why is it that you would expect then that Southern Water and UK Power Networks might turn up at an event together and talk to you about the next price control and their plans? For that sort of thing to take place, there need to be some understanding from the regulatory framework as to, well, that's what we want companies to be doing. And at the minute, I think the regulators do spend quite a lot of time talking together, but then they go away and they work up their own price control plans. They run to different cycles. We already within our own framework have different cycles for gas and electricity and for the different levels within it. So I think trying to ask regulators to coordinate, it's not impossible, but it's quite a bit of a different change to what we have today. And it's something that this report helps kind of put into focus, but it would require everybody to kind of join into that.
Can you just clarify one point for me, which is not applicable what you just said, but with renewables, won't the use of water in the industry drop significantly? Isn't most of water usage in what were the old carbon-based generation?
I think the report talks about generation and the use of water for generation, and that's come down significantly. Yes, that helps.
Because it's all cooling towers, isn't it, mainly?
Quite a lot of that. But then even at the local level, you talk about resilience and you talk about ability to protect the infrastructure against flash floods. There are reciprocal things whereby without power, quite a lot of the pumping stations will not operate. So you need a resilient energy infrastructure. Conversely, we have a number of our large substations in central London which are prone to flooding, not because of problems on rivers or things that you might see in more rural areas, but just because of burst water mains, where we've had to then put resilience into sites to protect against that. So it does need a two-way discussion across water and electricity to make sure that that environment is as structurally sound as possible.
I should say, just as a housekeeping point, you're going to be fed in a moment. The cameras are going to be switched off so that the nation doesn't watch you eat, but the discussion will continue. Okay.